So we're on Q&A. So I'll leave it to you to read out the email address.
Well, I
can't forget. It's oh, come on. It's Crime World Pod, is it?
crimeworldpod@sundayworld.com.
You sure?
No.
NASA, maybe if you were a little bit more responsible than either of us, you could... Oh, yeah, no, you're right. Sorry, it's crimeworld@sundayworld.com.
Are you sure?
Well, it says that in the bottom of the doc. crimeworld@sundayworld.com.
Okay.
So, a Q&A, everybody, if you have any questions for us, we're going to answer some questions now, shortly. And one of them in particular will appear very, very relevant after this start. But anyway, you email crimeworld@sundayworld.com, or you can contact us through, via our DMs. I've just been through my Instagram and my, what else do I have? Twitter and, DMs. And, there's very few of them I can read out.
Right, okay.
Just saying. There's very, very few. I'm just actually not even sure I can find one that I can read out.
A paraphrase.
No, I can't actually read any of them. It's like this. These are not dating apps, right? That's basically all I can say, right?
Yeah.
And I'll tell you what, LinkedIn is worse.
Is it?
Oh my God. Anyway, so we'll just put that down and we'll go to the official stuff.
Well, I think there's only one place to start after that intro, and it's from a guy called Shane, and he says, "Hi Nicola, big fan of the pod. A few questions which I or other listeners might have. How do yourself and Niall prepare for a pod? It sounds so natural, the flow of banter and actual detail of the topic being discussed. It never seems like you just wing it."
If it never seems like we just wing it, that is extraordinary.
Yeah.
Is all I can say.
Yeah.
If it never seems like that, I think Shane is just being kind, or else Shane is someone who actually knows us and is pretending to be Shane and is being sarcastic. How do we prepare for a pod?
Well, I do think there's a couple of things, right? Like podcasting is. I was listening to the radio the other day, actually, and somebody reporting on a crime story. And there is a very much a formality there, isn't there, on radio, which you do an awful lot of, or on TV.
I've got really bad at radio because I keep kind of being too blasé.
Yeah.
It's a totally different...
Medium,
yeah.
So Crime World has never really attempted to replicate the radio and put it on a podcast, have we?
No.
So it's not...
I don't know what we've ever attempted
well, you see, it's,
to do or be.
Well, you're attempting, I suppose, to tell a story. I mean, that's our background as newspaper journalists who've written for tabloid newspapers. So you learn that everything there has to be a narrative for something to be good. Do you know what I mean?
As we say to the kids, start, middle and end, please.
Well, yeah.
When they go to tell you a story.
But there actually, it has to be a story, and you have to be thinking of something that's interesting. And Crime World is kind of a continuation of that, I think.
Well, I mean, certainly as regards the preparations for it, I mean, sometimes we record quite a few podcasts in a row. And your preparations are, well, I mean, I certainly, if I'm interviewing somebody, okay, be serious here for a minute, but when I'm interviewing somebody, I will read up a lot, as much as I can. If somebody's written a book and I'm interviewing them, I like to have read the book. I don't always have time to do that, but I feel really underprepared if I haven't read the book, because I like to be able to ask some stuff that isn't obvious, from just reading the back page summary or whatever. At the same time, a lot of authors, in particular journalists, are very good at telling a story. So when you're interviewing other journalists, it can be quite easy. So if you're sort of unprepared, they almost gather that when you say to them, "Can I ask you to tell me this?"
Yeah,
and you can just guide them along through it.
Yeah, you're not... Yeah, so... But I mean, preparation, we tend to go and waffle for a few minutes about it.
Yeah.
I mean, that...
Now, having said that, a lot of the stuff we talk about, we do have a deep and a long sort of time knowledge of the subject that you sometimes need to brush up a little bit, read back exactly about dates, I find in particular.
But obviously the team of writers that we have come up with the jokes,
Yeah. We've such a team here, it's unbelievable.
No, I mean, But it is.
And it probably just all sounds so natural because that's exactly what it is. Certainly there is no high production values in crime world. For those of you who understand what those would be, they might be, yes, a team of writers having questions for us. There might be clips of newsreels running through it. We might come to a natural end and start again. We don't do any of that. We just go with the flow.
But you do think, though, if you think back to when crime world started, and I didn't really do any of them for a while, but there was an attempt to.
Took me a while to drag you in from under your rock.
It did, but if you think about it, there was an attempt to do something different than what even newspapers are traditionally done, which was to totally tell crime as hero cops and gurrier bad guys. There was an attempt to bring a bit of complexity to it, but to continue to tell a narrative of, because it is people's lives, and why are people interested in crime? It is kind of a morality tale, isn't it, to an extent? So yeah, that's a highfalutin version, isn't it?
Yeah, no, a little bit. But I mean, crime world, I suppose, is still the thing. I think the beauty of podcasting and podcasts are they can continue to develop and change, and you don't have to constantly do the same thing. No. Even though obviously week to week we provide plenty of content, we largely report on stuff that's happening. We go back to the same stories again and again to update them if people are appearing in court, if there's been cases heard, or if there's been developments in certain cases, we'll go back to that. And what you try to provide is a place where if people are listening to every single episode, they kind of think you might have repeated yourself, but you don't want people to have to kind of rewind back, 45 episodes to get that detail. So you give all the detail again.
Yeah.
You're trying to provide somebody with, I suppose, a deep dive into something in a period of time that goes between 30 minutes and 40 minutes. It's a commute, it's a walk, it's the time it takes you to potter around the house, to do whatever it is you do. I listen to podcasts all the time. I listen to them at night. I fall asleep, not listening to myself, obviously, but to others. And I listen to all sorts of stuff. And I do find that I never leave the house without my headphones.
Yeah.
And it's really how I get my media.
Yeah. Funnily enough, I listen to a lot of football podcasts. I mean, they were the big podcasts I listened to. But it's funny how the same things hold true, in that people they want to hear people with some specialist knowledge.
Yeah.
And they want to hear informality in podcasting. And that's why it is different, I think, than other mediums, like radio or like even TV,
Yeah, and the flow of banter is really just bullying one another in the workplace.
How do you prepare for it? You do try and throw me off the scent just before we start.
I do.
Try to have a little prod on me.
I try to give you a little...
Get me off.
And I also like to kind of lure you into a false sense of security somewhere, if we're in the car or if we're out having lunch or something, and I get you to sort of divulge something personal.
Yeah, which you then...
Or, something that I say to you, I won't tell anyone.
No.
And then I come out and tell...
I have got you good sometimes as well.
You have, in fairness to you, you have. So anyway, that's good that it never seems like we just wing it.
No.
That's brilliant. Do crime journalists all work through each other or exchange info and leads? For example, would you cross paths with Mick and Paul from Shattered Live, or are you arch rivals? Presumably not Kinahan Hutch levels of rivalry. No, this is referring to Mick O'Toole and Paul Healy, obviously colleagues of ours from the Mirror
and the Mirror Star. Yeah, the Mirror Group.
Mirror and Star.
Yeah.
And they run a podcast called Shattered Lives, which we often listen to.
Yeah.
Are we exchanging info? No. And leads?
No, but...
Do we cross paths? I would meet them very odd occasion on a story. In actual fact, the last story that I can remember meeting either of them was on the Hutch trial, when everybody was at that. You don't really...
No, I mean, I think there is... Like in newspapers, there's always been rivalry, hasn't there? And I mean, and that's a good thing for newspapers, because the competition keeps people going and you have to have competitors. And that probably is one of the sort of sadder things about modern journalism, as the newspapers have less people working for them. Some of that rivalry can diminish now. It's not some of that competition can diminish. But there's always competition for journalism, and it's one of the things that keeps it going. It's like
all journalists have big egos underneath it all.
Well, a former
I think you have to probably have a bit of an ego to want to put yourself out there, don't you?
Yeah, but I think that's part of the competitiveness and you know, not wanting people to do better, and that really pushes people forward. And you know, Mick and Paul are both really accomplished journalists, and you know, it's good to have competition in the podcasting sphere and others. Crime reporters have often been. I remember one editor, Neil Leslie, used to say, it's showbiz reporters are really they're very competitive, but it's crime reporters
are the worst. Really, really.
It's crime and showbiz are the ones that you know.
Yeah.
But like, you know, there's a limited, I suppose, number of people working.
Well, you see, I suppose
stories.
In a way, like everybody is somewhat on the same beat. Like, you know, if you're a reporter, a crime reporter, something occurs that you're going to cover, be it a press conference about the takedown of an encrypted phone network, a murder, a gangland murder, or something else that occurs. Everybody's on the same story.
Yeah.
Everybody's looking for a line.
Yeah.
There was a time that your story wouldn't appear, and I was actually speaking to Kieran O'Neill up in our northern bureau about this, about his story about Sinn Féin, and of course he wrote it.
Yeah.
And they changed the narrative within the time the story had gone to print, and by the time it came out on the Sunday, and of course then the story had changed online before the print story comes out in the first place. You know, it's a kind of an odd thing now. Yeah. But there was a time when the first sniff of your story would only be when the newspaper arrived on the desks, into the doorways, into the newsagents.
But there's a long tradition of journalists, crime reporters and all others who will help each other with that sort of stuff. If there's a press conference and somebody, a tape recorder, as it used to be, didn't work, or reporters will always help each other with that sort of stuff.
Or else they lie in bed too long and miss the press conference and you give them the notes.
But all crime reporters would help each other with that sort of stuff. And then they obviously, but it's always that exclusive line that people are really protective and competing with each other.
Are we competitive here in Crime World?
With
in general, I mean, I do think, I certainly want it to be the best. And I want it to be, and I love when it's doing really well, which is, but thanks to the listeners always, I love when it hits the number one position in the charts. And of course the charts are always a movable feast. You know, something happens in Gaza and all of a sudden the political pods are doing, you know, are moving up. The algorithm for the figures is a bit peculiar. It seems to be like, you know, varied around, you know, who's
trending. Look, who knows?
Marketing and all this sort of stuff. I don't think it's necessarily just down to figures, but I do like to see it up there. I like to hear people talking about it. I like when people say that they learned something from it, from our wittering on or whatever. And I like the growth of it. Yeah. So I do think that there's a sort of a competitiveness without that, or within all that, you know, still, even though at the same time I like to think that I've settled down and I really don't. You're
not driven by that.
I'm not driven by what other people are doing anymore.
Yeah, but look, I mean...
Are you?
Well, I don't think... I mean, do you have a bit of a hole in your soul left? Does that drive the competition, the sense of competition? I suppose maybe it does a bit, but...
Is that what it is, a hole in my soul?
Well, it could be. Oh. It could be.
I'd say there's plenty of holes in my soul.
Well, there's a couple of gaping ones of my own, but... No, I mean, competition is good, and Shattered Lies, you know...
don't overmarket it, thank you.
No. Shattered Lies, but we're not,
That's
we're not.
The third time you've said that
we're
word.
Not.
Three times people need to hear something before it goes into their brains.
Well, we're not.
Watch their figures.
We're not ordering. We're not ordering any hits on anybody.
No, we're not. We're definitely not doing that, no. There's enough of them out in the streets. Now, how do you keep up with the who's who of crime land, gangland, I suppose? I've visions of your office walls being full of massive posts. It's the form of a large organisation chart. I think that means one of those sort of
the old
Homelands. Do you remember Homelands?
Yeah,
do you remember she was so crazy and the cameras would pan out and she'd be surrounded by these post-its everywhere with... I actually do think those things are really good when you're trying to get into your head a criminal organisation. Now, the likes of the Kinahan organisation is so complex and there's so many moving parts of it. to structure that into a mapping system of faces, almost a family tree, can be really, really helpful.
Yeah.
To stand back and look at it and start to understand it. I think it's really helpful for readers and people who are overwhelmed with the amount of names and with a graphic, a visual is really good for that.
I think when you do that, and we've done it a few times, certainly we did it with the Bomber Kavanagh organisation, but we also did it with the Limerick gangs, I remember previously. And when you do that, you see how deeply family ties, blood relatives matter in criminal organisations in Ireland. We tend to think of them, as kind of names and maybe even regional gangs. But when you see them actually written out, they're almost always blood ties and marriage ties play a huge, huge role in it. Like in a criminal organisation in Ireland, people think about hundreds of people and all of that, but it's really only, most of them are going to be a core group of even 6, 7, 8 people. Now, each of those 8 people then may have other people spiralling out of them in the family trees, but a core group is really tends to be quite small, and that's why police forces can make really big inroads if they put a few of them behind bars. Now, the other people that are in their individual family trees will go on, but it's kind of, the love-hate thing was really true, where you had that niche organisation. It was really 6 or 7 people, I think, in it,
I totally watched Love Hate Again recently. It is so good.
Yeah.
It's actually, I don't know, it's one of those things, is it like, The Wire, you watch the second, it's even better the second time or something. Actually just referring to that question, back to the visions of our office walls being covered. So maybe I'll explain. You can see how this is a beautiful studio we're in. It is absolutely fabulous, and it's top of the bus, and audio here is a big, big thing that's being invested in, and video and everything. And this is a new form of journalism, really. This is a new way of bringing people journalism. But these offices have transformed unrecognisably, really, in the last 10 years. So our Crime World, the Sunday World, the Irish Indo is all owned by a big company called Media House, who are Belgians, and they own a lot of media companies in the Netherlands, in Germany, in Luxembourg, and they're very European. Yeah. And they have turned this, what was a very old-fashioned, dirty, filthy newsroom into a very woke sort of an organisation. I mean, it is quite spectacular inside here. We're on Talbot Street, obviously, but when you come into the building, it is pretty beautiful. I mean, the kind of the common areas and all that are just fabulous and clean, because to me, in the past, newspaper buildings, offices were always filthy. You'd come home, your hands would be dirty from the ink. They were dirty places that gathered dust and everything. In the past, the Sunday World corner of these offices was a very sort of colourful place. There was a cabinet belonging to our former editor Colin McGinty, and in it was a collection of items that had been sort of picked up on the road on certain jobs. One item was a hat belonging to the rapist Larry Murphy that had flown off his head as he was running for cover around Grafton Street, and one of the photographers picked it up. That was there. I think there was a stash of various probably narcotics that had been bought on the streets undercover.
There was also female underwear that there was a couple of female prisoners who were in Mountjoy were kind of running a sort of sex line, I suppose, from the Doka Centre, and I had to go, and they asked for underwear to be sent in, and I had to go and buy it.
Right.
I can't remember why we didn't send it all in, but we sent some of it in.
Yeah.
And I had to put the expenses in, of course, for
the female underwear.
So
it was a display cabinet it was a strange display cabinet. There was a couple of bullets in it, because one particular day,
somebody had found a
guy had phoned. I think Mick McCaffrey was involved anyway, but a guy had phoned to say that he'd found a load of bullets, and he was coming in to deliver them to us. And anyway, the guy came in and it was a box of bullets. And I remember myself and Mick put them in the boardroom on the table. We didn't really know what. We rang the police, I think, to tell them that they were there and they could come and collect them. They didn't have a squad car at the time and had to get the bus to come and collect. It was a very strange, it was like a kind of a, you know, one of those semi-dream situations. But I think we kept a couple of them in the in that cabinet. And of course there was always the walls were always filled with make-up posters of people in particular different. I mean, your head was on bodies of all sorts, and there was.
I mean, I famously answered the phone. Somebody had rang up, and I said, "Oh, send me an email, niall.donald@sundayworld.com." And they obviously couldn't hear me or whatever. And it just went on and on. I was saying, it's like McDonald without the Mac. A big picture of me then.
Oh, with Ronald McDonald?
Yeah.
But you were Ronald McDonald. I mean, that was the thing. You could never say anything except... And there was just this... I mean, there was wallpaper of these things and all of us caught in funny positions or, you know, walking along with various criminals and they'd have little things coming out of her. But all of those days went when these very sophisticated Belgians came in and...
Not because they asked it to go now.
Not because they asked it to go, because they cleaned up the place and they sort of have... The walls have kind of quotes on them now and sort of... It's all very serene and...
Inspirational quotes.
Inspirational. So, no, we don't have networks of criminal organisations on the walls as a result of that. Blame the Belgians.
Yeah.
Yeah?
Okay, I'll read one here. Don't blame the Belgians, by the way. And it's from Anonymous, so I won't read it all because he...
Yeah, be careful with this
You
one.
know. So he basically says, "Hi, I love the podcast and I listen to nearly every one. Please excuse the email address, but I want to maintain some anonymity. And I want to know if you have any recent information about Derek McLaughlin and Brian O'Reilly. Himself and Brian O'Reilly were linked to Eamon the Don Dunn, and Derek McLaughlin was a pallbearer at the funeral." So I think this is an interesting...
I remember Brian O'Reilly. I don't remember Derek McLaughlin.
So Derek McLaughlin was a guy who was very memorable. You might remember because he was very, very heavily muscled, I suppose, and he was...
What do you mean by that now?
Well, he was a bodybuilder.
Oh, right, okay.
And he looked like a bodybuilder.
Yeah.
He was one of the guys who was almost...
One of my...
Yeah, one of genuine meathead, and you know.
I'm not into bodybuilders, by the way.
So, and he survived an assassination attempt, as did Brian O'Reilly.
As a matter of interest, was he shot?
Jeez, I can't remember.
Yeah.
No.
I'm sure he does.
Yeah.
I only wonder that because, you know, you often find that people who are heavily muscled, that the bullets tend to embed in the muscle and they don't go further into the organs and they tend to survive.
So, look, I mean, both of these guys, but it's an interesting, I suppose, to look at these people and some of the other questions we've addressed about why do you write about this person and not about that person. These guys, Brian O'Reilly and Derek McLaughlin, would have been really regular appearers in the Sunday World. They were very much, as we spoke about earlier, at that core group of people surrounding Eamon the Don Dunn. At the time, Eamon Dunn was literally, I'd say, in the Sunday World every weekend for a period of 2 to 3 years. Most of the time, he wasn't being named. He was being referred to as the Don, but he was still there every week, and they had a huge, huge presence in Irish gangland. Probably we didn't fully appreciate it at the time how much they were really just a client organisation for the Kinahan cartel, who certainly were maybe one step removed from what was happening in Dublin. Eamon the Don Dunn had grown up as part of the Marlow Highland gang, but when he was believed to have played a role obviously in the murder of Marlow Highland, but when he took over that gang, which was I think probably still the most lucrative criminal organisation in the country, and they controlled certainly Finglas, where a lot of them were from, Finglas and Ballymun, but also Blanchardstown. And then they had these client organisations like the Earring Gang and Sligo. So they were a huge gang, and Brian O'Reilly and Derek McLaughlin were there. But what happens is, you know, once that organisation is taken over, these guys fall out of the paper. And a lot of people, they get that way if they're not actively involved in things occurring. And you spoke about The Wire, and it's very much true that and it's a constant theme in The Wire, where they're discussing, the criminals are discussing whether if you're bringing bodies, you're going to bring heat. And Eamon Dunn, I think, ordered, I don't know the exact number, and some of these
16 or 18 or something.
16 or 18, and some of them are, in dispute. I mean, a huge amount of murders. If you consider there's not been 18 murders in the last 3 years, I think, in Ireland put together. So that's where the heat comes on.
This question is interesting because it also says that while these guys weren't appearing anymore in the Sunday World, that they were spotted, or one of them was spotted with Cornelius Price having a meeting at a McDonald's in North Dublin, which there's a Kentucky Fried Chicken and a McDonald's, both of them in North Dublin, that are, I mean, it's extraordinary the amount of meetings that take place in them.
Yeah, because they're near these roads where people can come and go from across the country.
They're actually also a very familiar spot for guards to pop in and get snacks in them and all the rest of it, because there's often been funny situations where there's people meeting and all of a sudden they think we're under surveillance, but the lads are only in to get their Big Macs or whatever, And
certainly there's certain stations where gangs from Limerick and gangs from Louth and everywhere else could all congregate. But really, if you are a criminal and you want to avoid both Garda and media attention, if you're not committing murders, your chances are far, far better. I mean, that is just a fact, isn't it?
I mean, look, meeting Cornelius Price wasn't the best idea if you wanted to keep under the radar. And of course, it just also shows me that it is a finite amount of people that exist in Ireland's gangland. I mean, we're talking hundreds now, but that's still a finite compared to the population. And, when they rise up the organisations in a place like Cornelius Price, they're even more finite, and they all do know one another.
They all know one another, and a lot of them have these connections from prison sentences in particular. I mean, they absolutely get put in, of course, places like Portlaoise prison, and they just make these webs of connections through the prison system. Certainly when Christy Keane was in Portlaoise, he forged this sort of connection with Brian Rattigan. They wouldn't have had any natural connection. So things like that really happen through the prison system. But yeah, it's...
I want to go to some of the questions about Katie Simpson, but first, before we do, let's stick with the topic, and considering the cogs of the brain are now beginning to work a bit, I think this is a really interesting question from TJ. Do you think the feud would have ended up being as bad as it was if Daniel Kinahan was killed instead of David Byrne?
Well, I mean, that's...
Just take a moment on that.
Well, it's an interesting question. I think if you look at it in the broader context of what had happened in Irish gangland by 2016 when the Regency occurred, at that point the Kinahan cartel had become so big that they were almost, it appeared they were sort of unmanageable by the Irish state. The police didn't really have a handle on them. I think in the core, the top of the organisation, they were making huge amounts of money. They were absolutely feared. So Wood taking, and a lot of that, while Christy Kinahan Sr. obviously remains, a key person and heavily involved in criminality and all of that, certainly a lot of the violence was being driven by Daniel Kinahan. So what would have happened if he had been murdered?
No, was the feud going to end up as bad as it was if Daniel Kinahan was killed instead of David Byrne? I think it wouldn't have been, right? Because I think the murder of David Byrne brought together the sort of the bloodthirstiness of two individuals who were seriously dangerous at that time. One was Daniel Kinahan, obviously, who had to avenge the second or third attempt on his life, and he really had to flatten this once and for all. And the second, of course, was Thomas Bomber Kavanagh, who was David Byrne's brother-in-law. And it was, it was like David Byrne was, not the intended target as such, but he was nonetheless killed. And I think that brought together Kinahan and Bomber Kavanagh into this really dangerous pair, where Bomber Kavanagh was willing to take on a lot of the work within the region and from his groupings and from his network of contacts, from his hit teams that he knew was able to put together and was able to offer logistic and weapon support to. And then you had Daniel Kinahan, who was based in Dubai, so far away from it, and didn't really care what happened, but wanted it known that anybody who came near him was going to be annihilated. And he wanted the Hutch organisation taken out for personal reasons. Now, if Daniel Kinahan had have been killed that day in the Regency Hotel, clearly his father, Christy Kinahan Sr., would have avenged the death of his son. Would he have continued to do that, and would he have gone after anybody that was low-hanging fruit surrounding the organisation, the Hutches? Would he have gone after the hit team only? Would he have rained hell and fury on an entire family and community? Would it have gone back to business as usual? What would have happened?
I mean, it's impossible to know, but I think
it's an incredibly interesting question, I think.
It is, but I think what certainly had happened was that a monster had been created in allowing the Kinahan cartel to grow so big and so well resourced in this country, and it was inevitable that they were going to have to be tackled on a higher level, which the Guards have done incredibly successfully in the space of just 8 years. And something was eventually going to force the state to take determined and considered action against them. Whether we would have got to that moment anyway, I think, without the Regency. Obviously, an individual died, and that's a separate matter. But the Kinahan cartel would have had to be dealt with. And we've seen the same with all, because eventually they were going to cause enough murder and mayhem anyway, because that is the path they were on.
But with the death of Daniel Kinahan, had he died that day, the Kinahan organisation would have been hugely weakened. And I think that they would have, others would have moved in very swiftly to take up, because he was so significant in the business front and at that point as in the boxing end of things.
And also in the international context. So look, it's impossible to know.
But it is fascinating, because it's almost a sliding doors moment, isn't it?
It is, and you wonder, it's an old debate in history whether is it caused by great men, like Adolf Hitler, or is it caused by social conditions like why Nazi Germany arose. And that's a big debate, isn't it? Whether it's one or the other.
Were the top players at the head of the table as cutthroat as Daniel? Certainly his international business partners, yes, most definitely. Within the actual Kinahan organisation, you look at what the US Treasury detailed as the head of the table: Bernard Clancy, Johnny Morrissey, I think a cutthroat individual to say the least. Others there, Sean McGovern, I think he would be.
I think as well, if it's the level of money to be made gives rise to people.
Were any of them leaders?
Well, I mean, I think if
I think McGovern could have been.
Well, if if there is that level of money, that's going to attract a certain type of personality, and whether it's Daniel or somebody else, it's going to give rise to that kind of, which we've seen again and again. Once these cartels get big enough and well resourced enough, they tend to end up going on murder sprees really effectively,
Anyway, TJ says loves the pod. Now, just to get on to the murder of Katie Simpson, because I'm working away obviously on this, and we have a regular guest on this podcast, Tanya Fowles, who is a journalist who covered this story from the very beginning, and who was more than a journalist. She was a campaigner really for justice for Katie Simpson. And when the PSNI were refusing to investigate Katie Simpson's death as anything other than what Jonathan Creswell had told them it was, being a suicide, she persisted and kept at them until eventually a murder inquiry was launched, and indeed Jonathan Creswell was charged with murder and died as his trial opened. A fascinating story that sort of it's a very dark story for the horse industry in this country, for show jumping and for everything else around it. But This question from Jackie: has Katie Simpson's family ever spoke out on why they never tried to help her and get her away from Jonathan Creswell? ? So Jackie, the family did speak on a BBC Spotlight special
case, yeah.
which was on a couple of weeks ago. It is available on the BBC Player, I think.
Yeah.
But to get the BBC Player down south, you have to use one of those scrambled VP.
Yeah, I mean, it's not as easily accessed, maybe, yeah.
You can't get it. You have to scramble your... Anyway, but nonetheless, they did speak, and they basically... Her mother, Nolene, spoke, and her sister, Rebecca, spoke, and they describe really how they didn't know what was going on, how Jonathan Creswell was at her bedside in the hospital. He was there when she died, and later was one of the chief mourners at the funeral. They were very upset during the interviews, and they said they didn't basically, they had no idea, that they thought he was basically in a relationship with Christina Simpson, her older sister, and they all round just thought he was an ordinary guy, I think. Her sister Christina hasn't spoken. She obviously was living with Jonathan Creswell. She has still his 2 children. And she was in the house the night that Katie Simpson died. And exactly what happened that night, there are still a huge amount of questions around it. Journalists are still asking for inquiries into that, into the whole circumstances around it. In a way, I've seen and spoken to people whose relatives, children, whatever, have been in abusive situations and relationships that involve coercive control. I think it's easy for us from the outside to say that we would have stopped it. It seems to be different when you're living with that. And
of course, when people are adults, even if they're your children, it's very hard to get them to do what they should do or what you think they should do. We did a pod before about a guy called Vessel Jahiri, who killed his partner, or his ex-partner, Anna Finnegan. And I remember that story really well because I spoke to family and friends, and they spoke about all the efforts that they made to try and get her away. But we get it constantly, actually, emails in from people speaking about abusive ex-partners who are abusive to them. And, they always carry this kind of guilt or shame that people were saying stuff for them and they just would not take it in. And often this comes at the end of a court case when something really violent happens. It's very easy to look at a distance and say, I wouldn't let my sister, daughter, whatever, stay in an abusive relationship like that. But it proves, or I wouldn't stay in something. But
at the same time, on a wider level, Jonathan Creswell, his activities were known by a lot of people. His abusive behaviours were seen by a lot of people, and a lot of people appear to have turned a blind eye to it. He, to me, seems to be one of these guys that are abusing, committing crimes in plain sight.
Yeah, again, he's a part of a kind of, look, you couldn't compare it to the Catholic Church or some of these organisations like the Scouting
Jimmy Savile, look at the Jimmy Savile situation.
Yeah, exactly. So you get these closed little worlds, like the equestrian world. And in some ways, if abuse starts there, all of a sudden everybody is kind of covering it up. And it happens in those kind of closed little societies. And that certainly seems to have happened with Jonathan Creswell.
Johnny Creswell also seems to have had this power, he emanated this almost celebrity-like power that people wouldn't challenge him. His abuse of her appears to have started when she was still a child. The hospital admissions, which number 17 to 19, he's bringing her in time and time again. He's the guy who's given the story that she's fallen from a horse. She breaks her back at one stage. There's been horrific injuries. And I think really what makes Jonathan Creswell and all that went on around him stand out is the 2010 conviction for the horrific abuse against Abigail Lyle.
Yeah, I mean, well reported.
He pleaded guilty to that, and Abigail Lyle very bravely waived her anonymity. She spoke outside the court. She gave details of what happened to her. She did a video with a women's domestic violence charity and gave a big interview about that. A lot of victims never feel capable of doing that. Do you think we've time for one last question?
One last one.
And I want to, can I complain a little bit?
Go on.
I got my COVID jab today.
Yeah.
I can't lift my arm.
Yeah, well, maybe you should send Bill Gates an email and ask him to turn off the microchip.
Honestly, I'm just like, I probably have a little dose of it here.
Yeah.
And I got my flu jab in this arm, and look, I can do that.
Yeah.
But I can't actually do that. What's going on? I'm going to set off all the conspiracy theorists
really
now
are,
with this. Finally, I suppose this one is from Breen. Oh, by the way, anybody who wishes to send in more Q&As, we've loads more actually to get to. I'll finish with this one, but we will do another one in a week or two's time. crimeworld@sundayworld.com, or Niall Donaldo, as you call yourself on your social media. You can slip into his DMs or you can slip into mine. But I would request that
Keep the romance out of
the romance out of this. This is nothing to do with romance. Anyway, Breen says, big fan of the podcast. Came to see you live in Limerick a few months ago. Thank you very much. As a regular reader and listener, my question is this. How come we never hear or see anything about John the Colonel Cunningham? Thank you. And I feel the same because we have such limited information on him. It's like as if he's just gone dark on us. He, of course, was arrested along with his then business partner, Katie Simpson Sr. in May 2010 in Spain, brought before the courts. He was given bail in Spain under Operation Shovel, and he just, disappears. I'd heard he was in Barcelona.
Yeah, I mean, he was as well meant to be back in Marbella as well, wasn't it reported to us at one stage? Like, John Cunningham...
We spotted him once at the funeral of his brother Michael Cunningham, who died in the aftermath of that, I'm thinking around 2013, 14 or something
like that.
He did come home briefly for that, but that was it. And where is he? And what's he doing?
Yeah, because if you consider the significance of if that operation in 2010, he was regarded as literally being the number 2 in the organisation ahead of people like Daniel and Christie Jr. He'd been somebody involved in criminality since the 1980s. He'd been nicknamed the Colonel because of his kind of military discipline in carrying out what was then mostly armed robberies. He'd been convicted in connection with the kidnapping of Jennifer Guinness, one of the most infamous crimes of its day. Had been served a vast majority of that sentence before walking out of an open prison, and it ended up in Amsterdam, where he, along with Katie Simpson, who he seems to have struck up a friendship with in prison, they'd set up one of the first sort of major drug trafficking rings in Amsterdam. So he eventually gone to prison in Amsterdam. So all through all those years, committed to criminality. When he come out again in the 2000s, he'd gone, moved to Portabanús, living beside Christie, absolutely committed to criminality. I mean, wasn't he always meant to have said to being a good family man? Wasn't that one thing that they did say about him?
He certainly was supposed to have looked after his wife and children. He moved them to Amsterdam and they've been based there.
And I think even in some of the surveillance, there was some acknowledgement of how committed he was to his wife.
I think he was getting a bit of a bollocking because he wasn't home on time for dinner or something in some of the wiretaps.
He didn't strike them as, because obviously people like Curtis Warren were over there basically living in brothels. But John Cunningham was notable for being a kind of a family guy.
Well, a guy who got home for his dinner, you know, which is always so ironic, isn't it? And, you know, in plenty of these guys, like in the normal world, in many ways, the wives can wear the trousers. It just depends on the personalities, doesn't it?
Well, I think in most cases they probably don't. But certainly in this case, he's fallen off the radar.
Yeah, so if anybody has seen him or spotted him or knows where he is, I always say that actually. I'd love to track down John Cunningham. I'd love to know what he's doing, where he is. Did he retire? Is he still involved in crime? He was one of these fellas that was always waiting for the big one. Yeah. Always waiting for the...
But remember now, I mean, and you'll know it better than anybody, but Georgie the Penguin Mitchell absolutely disappeared for almost 20 years until you tracked him down to a most unlikely location in Germany. So sometimes, you know, it can happen that if they're really committed to staying off social media and stuff like that, they can disappear.
Yeah. So, what were you saying it was that our pal Stephen Dempster said to you?
He described me as the brains of the operation.
No, just which operation are we talking about?
Just, I think in general, just the...
Am I to be insulted by that?
Well, if you can, yeah. Well, if you had the brains to be, you probably would be insulted.
You're going to suffer for that.
Oh, right, okay.
You know that?
Hey, that's
you know when you go too far.
That's too much, is it? That wasn't fair. Appalls.
So anyway, that's what he said.
That's what he. Yeah, exactly. Blame the BBC.
The brains of the operation.
Yeah.
Fucking BBC. Wouldn't you know? So there we go. I mean, that's just a little bit of a response to some of the. Sorry, I'm looking at all my emails, and again, I can't read most of them out. The complaint. Yeah, no. I mean, the only ones I could read out are the official ones from this media house that we work for.
Well, maybe we'll come back to it again. But
I'll have to try and organise myself and put the. We could have maybe a sort of an X-rated.
Could we? No, I don't think so, Nick.
Crime Con.
I don't think so.
Or Crime World Q&A. Do you not think so?
Maybe, yeah.
I'd
maybe
say if I went through that phone of yours now.
Subscription only.
I would say.
Yeah.
I'd say if I went through that phone of yours now, I'd
really
find
wouldn't,
plenty
unfortunately.
of stuff.
No. But, you know, it's good to imagine that you would.
Right, so look, let's leave it at that and we'll come back to the Q&A over the coming weeks.
Thanks very much, Nicola.
All right. I'm Nicola Tallant and you're watching Crime World, a podcast about criminals, drugs and the underworld in Ireland and across the globe. Make sure you subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you can be the first to watch all our latest episodes. You can also listen wherever you get your podcasts.